Hello, Culture Matters podcast. This is going to be a fun Beyond Order Rule 7. We're talking about Dr. Peterson, Jordan B. Peterson's book, Beyond Order series. Rule 7 today. Before I introduce the rule, here's a quote just for this episode. Something we cannot see protects us from something we do not understand. The thing we cannot see is culture and its intrapsychic or internal manifestation. The thing we do not understand is the chaos that gave rise to culture. If the structure of culture is disrupted unwittingly, chaos returns. We will do anything to defend ourselves against that return. Preface: The Maps of Meaning, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Today's rule, Rule 7. So excited about this rule. It's fundamental in the 12 more rules for life beyond order, and really I think a crux of the theory around maps of meaning and so much more. It's work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. Work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. Now, we've come from rule 1 through 6. What's interesting about this rule is that if we are working as hard as we possibly can on at least one thing and seeing what happens, I th- I think part of the argument of the beyond order and really maps of meaning is that we are less likely to compromise rule 1. We are less likely to carelessly denigrate, carelessly denigrate social institutions. We're likely to, we are less likely to carelessly criticize the West, for example, our culture, for example, to carelessly criticize. In the fourth, in the fourth sub chapter of the chapter, Dogma and Spirit, Dr. Peterson makes an argument of what Christ, the Judeo-Christian, right, element of the West, Christ represents the product of tradition and the creative spirit to revitalize it, to improve it, to transform it. And we as individuals, or individuality, individual development, there's something about our individuality that when we go through the process of apprenticeship, when we go through the process of mastery, when we actually become a master, we're not going to carelessly denigrate social institutions and creative achievements, but maybe carefully judge, carefully critique, carefully attempt to transform and make better. For example, in this Dogma and Spirit chapter, quote, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Christ therefore presents himself as both the product of tradition and the very thing that creates and transforms it." Quote, "Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Matthew 5:17. If I've lost you, please give me another moment. You're thinking, what is this, a religious sermon? No, the argument that Peterson is making is around our individual, around our what individual development actually is. In subchapter 1, the value of heat and pressure, and the worst decision of all. When Dr. Peterson was working alongside the PhD students, he noticed that those that pursued education for a greater period of time, that actually it's not only what they learned, but what they became in the process of the learning. becoming more articulate, more disciplined, and how that actually had a relationship with becoming a person in a Rogerian sense. Carl Rogers, right? Becoming a person. Apparently, we have many personalities, and that's been elucidated on in maps of meaning through some of the myths, the Mesopotamian myths. There are many personalities. I'm thinking about when I think Marduk's father is killed by all these by the children. Yes, there's basically like a deep. Pagel talks about how the demon has not necessarily a face, but multiple faces. There are all these different personalities as a consequence of all of these different impulses that we have, as a consequence of just being a person, biologically, psychologically, socially. There are all of these impulses and emotions and feelings, and a culture and its foundation reflects on these. So the more culture, the cultural foundation cracks, the more our the vying personalities fighting for dominance in the hierarchy of our personality come into light or are exacerbated, and the more dramatic the swings of emotion. We look at our current society and the prevalence of anxiety and depression. And the argument is it has a relationship with the identity crisis of the culture today because the individual and the culture, they relate to one another. So work as hard as you possibly can, at least one thing, and see what happens is about actually becoming a person. It's about actually realizing that picking something to go deep on, picking some trade, some skill, something that can be a component of your identity. One of the values of the West, the values of capitalism, believe it or not, is becoming something like, for example, Peterson, the psychologist, you know, you, the plumber, you, the construction worker, you, the tile person. The process of actually apprenticing, following before you lead, will actually help subdue or put in their proper place all the different personalities that are vying for control over your humanity. And the person that the less integrated a person is in this hierarchy of personalities, the more anxiety and depression that we will have. So it's interesting that rule 7, work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. If we do that, well, then that implies rule 2. Imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that. So, for example, these college students pursuing a PhD that had to do more work actually showed that not only that they improved as humans, their ability to articulate, their ability to discipline, but the more work that they put on their plate, the better that they actually did, the better that their grades actually were. So it's not like, oh, if I do less and I just do enough to get by, I'm going to do better and things will be easier. That's not how our nature works. It's the more that we put on ourselves, if we're disciplined, if we have an aim, if we're disciplined, if we're in the right culture, and it's a if it's something that calls to us, that's a part of our nature that we've discovered, like this is the talent that we're looking to develop the skill set around. If all these components come together, we'll feel a calling, a sense of purpose. There will be meaning in the suffering and the sacrifice and the discipline to master something. And it's the argument in Rule 7 is that when we've mastered, we embody as individuals this metaphor, this analogy with Christ being the product of tradition, and all as well as the the capacity to transform and evolve it for the better. It's not carelessly denigrating social institutions and creative achievements. It's carefully critiquing, judging, stewarding the culture in its evolution uh, to actually work as hard as we possibly can, at least one thing, and see what happens. We have to embody rule two. Imagine who we could be and aim single-mindedly at that. The process of working on something as hard as we possibly can, seeking to master something, may force us to look into the fog because or even the process of pursuing it could help us work through the fog, not right there. If there's a relationship with the hierarchy of our personalities vying for control over our individuality, the better we get at something, the better we have to be as a in our character to actually develop the skills and to become that thing, to harness culture, to harness knowledge, and to synthesize it through our being in a content and a contextual form. It impacts our identity. It will actually help us not hide things in the fog. For example, the more competent I feel about what it is that I'm doing, the more confident I may be on speaking up and not repressing my thoughts, feelings, and emotions in the company meeting, for example, as well as work as hard as you possibly can at least one thing and see what happens. If I'm doing that, I'm not succumbing to what Osiris succumbed to. If you've listened to Rule 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. I'm not abdicating responsibility. For example, the students that got their 4-year degree, they succeeded at that goal. Maybe now they're Osiris. However, they stop paying attention. They're now I'm gonna plenty of students get a 4-year degree. Their next, this is what it's about. It's about an aim, not necessarily a context. Some may not want to become get their PhD. The others may desire truly to get this career. They have an aim. They know what they want to do. They know why they want to do it. They have an idea of how they're going to do it, and then they're going to commit themselves to that career. That's an aim. That's not falling into Osiris, stop paying attention, abdicating responsibility, and the nihilism that comes from that, and the malevolence in Seth, his brother, killing him and destroying the culture, yada, yada, yada. But it's getting the degree and then taking one's foot off the gas, maybe celebrating for too long, or not being clear on, imagine you could be an aim single mindedly at that, not being clear on your vision. You're going to follow someone's vision. So you better hope that you're following a benevolent leader. You better hope that you are following the right people. That's a paradox. If you don't know enough, if you don't have a clear of aim, how do you know you're following the right people? Well, you're likely not going to follow the right people. If you have an aim, you might end up following the right people, and then you know that's okay too. Not everybody needs to be the number. Not everyone needs to be or can be the number one in the hierarchy of the company. However, and this I think what Peterson's making an argument about Christ being the product of tradition and what revitalizes it. Each of us in our core competency can, if we go through the apprentice phase and go through the mastery and become into mastery and aren't afraid to look the fool and be the fool, continue learning and balance our power with humility, our responsibility with humility, we will be in a position to transform the culture, to redeem the culture, to renew the culture through our competence. But if we don't develop that, we don't work on that aim, and we don't imagine who we could be, and we don't work as hard as we possibly can at least one thing and see what happens, we're not going to develop the character. We're going to get swallowed up by the fog. We're likely to abdicate responsibility. We're likely, rule 5, we're likely to do what we hate relative to. That's why I love this rule, relative to not working or working as hard as we possibly can at least one thing and see what happens. We're likely to do what we hate. We haven't made a choice. There's a quote I loved. It was people that don't, yeah, people that don't make a choice and go all in fall into, quote, they become lonely, isolated, and miserable. And all that merely adds the additional depth of bitterness to the cynicism that spurred the oscillation in the first place. That is not the sort of vicious cycle that you want to characterize your life. Those who do not choose a direction are lost. It is far better to become something than to remain anything but become nothing. You will do what you hate if you're unclear on what your aim is. And if you're clear on what your aim is, but you don't choose and then work toward and then grit your teeth and get it done, it's no surprise that cynicism and nihilism will creep into your life. The cynic questions everything and believes in nothing. The nihilist believes in nothing and does, and what they do isn't, they're not what they do. Well, they carelessly denigrate social institutions and creative achievements with ease. And that's where Rule 6 comes in. The nihilist evokes ideology in their pursuits. Abandon ideology is Rule 6. If we work as hard as we possibly can at least one thing and see what happens, we're less likely to succumb to ideology. We're more likely to transform culture and imbue truth in how we show up, imbue or imbibe. The properly functioning integrated individual tempers the desires of the present with the necessities of the future, committing to committing to the learning process and not quitting and staying consistent with it will help us be, develop our individuality. Our individuality is not expressed in our desire and capacity to follow any whim of impulse. It's reflected in our ability to discern between what is best in the future and what is necessary today. Those are the people that we trust to work with, to follow. Those are the people that we ultimately respect based on the fruit, what they've created in the world. Those are the people that will be able to see clearly when times get tough and things go wrong and there's chaos in the world. Quote, without a game, there is no peace, only chaos. Part of what makes games work are rules, order, playing by the rules. And part of the rules for life, here's number 19, I guess. Really 7 and beyond order. If you haven't read 12 Rules for Life or listened to the monologues yet, Rule 7. Work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. How much of this is the fact that people don't ever explore enough to what, discover that thing that they could work as hard as they possibly can and see what happens. You know, and what role does risk taking have in that? What role does tragedy have in that? What role does accountability have in that? What role does resourcefulness have in that? What role do resources have in that? We had Ian V. Rowe on the Culture Matters podcast, author of Agency, talking about family, the importance of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, who I saw speak at ARC, the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship. And he talked about the necessity of mentorship, the necessity of people. So someone, we talked about this on the show, an individual, a young person can lack the resources and can even have a strained, tenuous interpersonal relationships, parents, siblings, family, etc. But if someone on on a tertiary, a third party, like a teacher, a mentor, someone third party leans into them and sees something in them and gives them belief, gives them wisdom, gives them a path, that can actually be, this is something I was thinking about, the pulling back of the bow, the tension of the bow comes from the conflict, comes from the pain and suffering, comes from the inversion of value, comes from the negation of value. The worse your life is right now, that's more tension on the bow. That's more energy on the bow. Peterson is talking. So things going terrible and things going wrong is actually an opportunity, right? Notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Someone abdicated responsibility. You're a kid, you have no food, water, shelter. Parents aren't getting along. You're in the worst possible position as a consequence of someone else's abdication of responsibility. Parents, family, society, economics, whatever, the world, right? That bow is all the way pulled back. Peterson is saying, imagine who you could be and aim single mindedly at that. Ian Rowe is saying the power of mentorship, teachers, culture outside of the home, outside of the person's life, giving them a narrative that isn't a victim, but something more, a hero, right? In their hero's journey. Imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that. You have an aim now. You have pain and suffering, which is the bow, the tension of the bow, pulling back, pulling back, pulling back. Work as hard as you possibly can, at least one thing, and see what happens. Maybe you won't ever let go of the arrow. You even you have a target. You have all the pain and suffering. In 30 days of thought, I would say internal conf internal conflict presupposes external creation, but the working through of internal conflict leads to meaning. You, Working as hard as you possibly can, at least one thing, and see what happens is the right arrow is in there. It can't be a dull head. It's got to be it's got to be sharp enough and curated in a way that it can hit the target and stick the target. It can fly faster and farther. You could have an aim that's, 1,000 feet, but if you don't have the right arrow, it might only be able to go 500 feet, even though you had the right aim, you had the right amount of pain and suffering, right? Your negative 100 is more powerful to one is more powerful than negative 10 to one. Working as hard as you possibly can, at least one thing, and see what happens is the process of harnessing that pain and suffering into the values necessary to be a hero in the world, a hero in your hero's journey, a hero in life, to avoid ideology, to not even come close to ideology, to not do what you hate, to be responsible and not abdicate leadership, to not hide undaunted things in the fog, to actually be able to see who you could be and be able to achieve it, and to carefully judge culture in order to transform and improve it, just like Christ for the world. Share this with a friend that needs to figure out what's one thing that they could work hard as they possibly can to see what happens. The way I'm attempting to model that with the Culture Matters podcast, with our business, Culture Matters, working with our client partners, growing through the trials and tribulations of the markets of the world, of a changing world, that we become extremely successful doing so. Share this with a friend and listen to this quote. Quote, if you work as hard as you can on one thing, you will change. You will start to also become one thing. Instead of clamoring multitude you once were. Quote, that one thing developed properly is not only the disciplined entity formed by sacrifice, commitment, and concentration. It is that which creates destroys and transforms discipline itself, civilization itself, by expressing its unity of personality and society. It is the very word of truth, upon whose function all habitable order, wretched out of chaos, eternally depends. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. As our culture is shifting and in conflict, what we can do as individuals is work as hard as we possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens and be prepared to follow our conscience and do the best we can with what we have come to know, following our conscience in order to make the world a better place. Share this with a friend. Please leave us a review in the Culture Matters podcast. Go listen to Rule 1 through 6, and please Rule 8 through 12 and all of 12 rules for life. We will see you next time.